The wind had been screaming for 2 days when the 3 men finally broke through the last drift. It was not a sound of simple weather. It was a high, thin shriek that scoured the landscape and stripped the warmth from a man's bones right through his coat. They were in the heart of the Wyoming Territory, in a January so bitter it felt like a personal judgment from God. The snow was waist-deep in the flats and piled 10 feet or more against the lee side of every rock and rise. For the last hour, they had been fighting their way up the shallow grade to the widow's homestead, a place the youngest of them, David, had never been. Mr. Sterling, a man whose face was a roadmap of 50 hard winters, led the way, his shoulders slumped with the effort. Behind him, Bartholomew Thorne cursed with a low, steady venom that was almost lost in the gale. Thorne owned the mercantile in Prairie Ridge, the only one for 50 miles, and he considered this entire expedition a fool's errand. "We're wasting our time, Sterling," Thorne shouted, his voice thin against the wind's roar. "She's been alone up here for a week. Her nearest neighbor is you, and you're 5 miles of hell away. No woman could survive this." Sterling didn't turn around. He just kept pushing, his snowshoe sinking with each weary step. "Audrey Hale is tougher than you think." "Toughness doesn't keep a fire lit when the wood's buried under 6 feet of snow," Thorne countered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "It doesn't keep the cold out of a clapboard cabin built for 2, not 1. And she's not 1. She has that ancient mother of hers. 2 women and a dog. We're going to find 3 frozen bodies, mark my words. All for a homestead claim that's not worth the paper it's on." Sterling stopped and turned, his eyes narrowed slits in his frost-rimed face. "The land was worth enough for you to offer her pennies on the dollar for it 2 months ago." Thorne's lips tightened into a sneer. "That was a kindness. An offer to save her the trouble of starving. Her husband, Robert, had no business dragging her and her mother out to this godforsaken rock pile. He dies and leaves her with nothing but debt and dirt. I was being charitable." "Your charity always seems to line your own pockets, Thorne," Sterling said, his voice flat. He turned and resumed his trek without waiting for a reply. David, trailing behind them both, kept his head down. He was only 20, and the grim purpose of their journey sat like a stone in his stomach. He had seen what a Wyoming blizzard could do. Thorne was probably right. It was a recovery mission, not a rescue. They all knew the story. Robert Hale had succumbed to a lung fever in late autumn, leaving his wife, Audrey, and her elderly mother, Martha, to face the winter alone on their new claim. The Homestead Act promised them the land if they could prove it up, but this winter was testing everyone, even seasoned ranchers. For a widow with no help, it was a death sentence. When the blizzard hit, cutting them off from the distant town, Sterling had waited 2 days, his anxiety growing with every gust of wind that rattled his own sturdy home. On the 3rd morning, he'd ridden the 2 miles into the half-buried town and hammered on Thorne's door. As the town's most prominent citizen, Thorne's participation was a necessity, if only for appearances. He'd brought David along for his strong back. Now, as they crested the final rise, the cabin came into view. It was a small, dark shape against the swirling white, half swallowed by a massive drift that swept up against its eastern wall and onto the roof. A single curl of smoke, pale and thin, rose from the stone chimney. Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. "Well, look at that. The fire's still going. Probably the last of her furniture. We'd best be quick before the embers die." Sterling ignored him. His gaze was fixed on that fragile ribbon of smoke. It was a sign, but a faint one. It could mean anything. A fire could burn for hours after its keeper had frozen in their sleep. He quickened his pace, his heart a heavy, anxious drum in his chest. A deep, guttural bark echoed from within the cabin as they approached the porch. "Her dog, at least, is alive," David muttered, pulling his collar tighter. Sterling stomped the snow from his boots on the small, windswept porch. He raised a gloved hand and knocked hard on the wooden door. "Mrs. Hale." "Audrey." "It's John Sterling and some men from town." The barking inside intensified, a ferocious, warning sound. Then a woman's voice, calm and steady, called out. Kaiser, quiet. The barking subsided to a low grumble. Footsteps approached the door. A bolt scraped back, a sound crisp and loud in the cold. The door opened a few inches. Audrey Hale stood there. She was not the gaunt, frost-bitten wraith they had expected. Her face was pale but not hollowed by starvation. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wore a simple wool dress and an apron, and she was not even shivering. Behind her, a wall of warmth and the scent of baking bread washed over the three men, a stark, impossible contrast to the frozen world they had just fought through. She looked at the three of them, her gaze clear and direct. The big German shepherd at her side watched them with intelligent, wary eyes, a low growl still vibrating in its chest. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "I'm surprised to see anyone out in this. You must be frozen through. Please, come in." She opened the door wider. Sterling stepped inside, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene with his expectations. David followed, his mouth slightly agape. Thorne was the last to enter, his eyes sweeping the room with a look of pure, undisguised disbelief. The cabin was small, but it was a fortress of warmth and order. A fire blazed in the hearth, not a desperate, sputtering flame but a deep, steady burn of well-seasoned hardwood. A stack of logs, dry and perfectly cut, stood neatly beside it, enough for another day at least. On a table near the fire, 2 loaves of bread were rising under a clean cloth. In the corner, an elderly woman with silver hair sat in a rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap. She looked up and gave them a serene nod. This was Martha, Audrey's mother. "Gentlemen," Martha said, her voice frail but clear. "Nasty weather to be traveling." Thorne's eyes darted from the stacked wood to the rising bread, to the tidy shelves holding jars of preserves, to the sacks of flour and beans stacked against the far wall. It wasn't a scene of desperate survival. It was a scene of domestic peace. He saw no signs of hardship, no evidence of a struggle. It was as if the blizzard wasn't happening at all. "Mrs. Hale," Sterling said, finally finding his voice as he removed his hat. "We were concerned. This storm is the worst I've seen in a decade. We came to see if you needed help." Audrey smiled, a small, genuine expression that seemed to momentarily erase the worry lines from her face. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Sterling. Truly. But as you can see, we're managing. The storm is fierce, but the cabin is strong. My husband built it well." She gestured toward the fire. "Please, get close to the heat. I'll put a kettle on. A hot drink is the least I can offer for you coming all this way." Thorne stepped forward, his boots loud on the clean-swept wooden floor. He ran a hand over a sack of flour, his expression hardening. "Managing? Mrs. Hale, this is more than managing. You have enough supplies here to last until spring. And that's oak and hickory. It's dry. Where did you get it?" His tone wasn't one of admiration. It was an accusation. Audrey did not flinch from his scrutiny. She met his gaze, and for the first time, Sterling saw a flicker of something hard and unyielding in her eyes. The warmth of the cabin was her doing, but the steel that held it all together, that was hers alone. She had not been waiting for a rescue. She hadn't needed one. And the man who had come expecting to pick over the bones of her failure did not yet understand that he had just walked into a fortress not of wood and stone, but of quiet, unshakable preparation. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind howled with a renewed fury, piling snow against the single window and shrieking down the chimney. It was clear the men were not going anywhere. Audrey accepted this with the same unnerving calm she had shown since they arrived. "You'll have to stay the night," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It would be suicide to try and get back to town before this breaks. I can make up pallets by the fire. We have blankets enough." Sterling nodded gratefully. "We'd be obliged, Mrs. Hale. We brought some of our own rations, so we won't be a burden." "Nonsense," she replied, turning back to the stove. "There's plenty." Thorne, however, could not let his suspicion rest. He prowled the small cabin like a caged wolf, his eyes cataloguing every detail. He was a man who understood the world through a ledger of debt and credit, of supply and demand. What he was seeing did not balance. "This is a remarkable amount of firewood, Mrs. Hale," he said, kicking lightly at the end of a log. "My store ran out of seasoned hardwood a month ago. Everyone in Prairie Ridge is burning pine and praying it doesn't soot up their chimneys. Where did a widow woman come by a cord of oak this late in the year?" Audrey paused in her task of slicing vegetables for a stew. She looked at Thorne, her expression patient, as if explaining something to a child. "My husband cut it, Mr. Thorne. He spent last summer and fall doing it. He said a hard winter was coming. He could feel it in the air." "Your husband has been gone for 3 months, Thorne pressed. "This wood is stacked inside. It's dry. You're telling me you hauled all of this from the woodpile yourself?" "Through the snow." "I didn't have to," she said simply. "It was already here. We have a small woodshed attached to the back of the cabin. Robert built it so we could access the wood from inside. There's a door right behind that curtain." She gestured with her knife toward a heavy canvas hanging on the back wall. Thorne strode over and pulled the curtain aside. A small, sturdy door was set into the wall. He lifted the latch and opened it. A gust of cold air swirled in, but beyond it, they could all see a narrow, covered space, a lean-to built against the cabin, filled to the rafters with neatly stacked firewood, all of it protected from the elements. It was a simple, ingenious design. David let out a low whistle of admiration. He thought of everything. Thorne's face soured. He shut the door with a sharp thud. He had been so certain he would find in competence a woman unequipped for the harsh realities of the frontier. Instead, he found foresight and engineering. It was a direct challenge to his worldview, where widows were victims, not survivors. His failure to buy her land cheap now stung him with a fresh bitterness. The afternoon wore on. The scent of a rich beef stew now mingled with the smell of baking bread. Audrey moved about her small kitchen with an economy of motion that was both graceful and efficient. Her mother, Martha, occasionally offered a quiet word of advice or told a story from her own youth, her presence a pool of calm in the tense atmosphere. The dog, Kaiser, lay by the hearth, his head on his paws, but his eyes followed Thorne's every move. As dusk began to fall, a deep groaning sound echoed from above them. It was the sound of immense weight settling. Sterling looked up at the ceiling beams, his brow furrowed with concern. "That's the snow load," he said. "It's getting heavy. If it gets too wet and dense, it could threaten the roof." Thorne seized on this, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. Here, at last, was a problem a woman couldn't solve. "The roof will need to be cleared. We'll need shovels. A ladder." "We have shovels," Audrey said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "But a ladder won't be necessary. And you can't go up there in this wind. You'd be blown off before you took 2 steps. We have to do something," Thorne insisted, his voice rising. "Or this whole roof will come down on our heads. This is man's work, Mrs. Hale. Just tell us where the tools are." Audrey finally turned to face him fully. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked from Thorne to Sterling. "Mr. Thorne, my husband was not a foolish man. He knew this cabin stands in the path of the prevailing wind. He knew how the drifts would pile up." She walked to the corner of the room and pointed upward. Bolted to the main ceiling beam was a large iron ring. A heavy rope was tied to it, its other end coiled neatly on a hook on the wall. "The pitch of the roof is steep on the west side," she explained. "The wind is supposed to scour most of the snow off. But the east side is shallower, and it catches the drift." Robert anticipated this. He reinforced the rafters on that side, but as a final measure, she paused, looking at Sterling. He said if the load got too great, a man could, from the ground, throw the end of this rope over the peak. Once it's over, 2 men pulling from the west side can use it like a saw, cutting through the base of the drift and letting the whole mass slide off the steep side. No one needs to get on the roof at all. Sterling stared at the rope and then at the ceiling, a slow look of wonder spreading across his face. He was a builder himself, had put up his own house and barn. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and its understanding of leverage and weather. It was a solution born of deep thought and experience. By God, Sterling breathed. He really did think of everything. Thorne was speechless. He looked at the rope, at Audrey, and then back at the rope. He had come here as a rescuer, a figure of authority ready to take charge of a desperate situation. But there was no desperate situation. He was not in charge. He was merely a guest in a home that was better prepared for this storm than his own. Every display of Audrey's competence was a fresh humiliation, a testament to her and her late husband's superiority. "It hasn't come to that yet," Audrey said, her voice softening as she saw the look on Sterling's face. "The groaning has stopped for now. But the rope is there if we need it. Now, the stew is ready. You must all be hungry." As they ate, the mood shifted. Sterling and David asked Audrey questions about her husband, their voices full of a newfound respect. They spoke of him not as a failure who had died and left his wife in peril, but as a genius whose careful planning was still protecting his family. Thorne ate in sullen silence, his eyes narrowed. He was a man being proven wrong in the most fundamental way, and he did not like it. Later, as Audrey was clearing the plates, Thorne got up and walked over to the stack of supplies again. He ran his finger along a sack of beans. It was stamped with the name Cheyenne Freight and Supply. He didn't carry that line in his store. No one in Prairie Ridge did. It had to be shipped in from the territorial capital, a long and expensive haul. He turned, a new, sharper line of inquiry in his eyes. The wood, the cabin design, that was foresight. But this? This was money. And as far as he knew, the Hales had none. The mystery of her survival was not solved. It had only deepened. He did not yet know that the key to it all lay not in a woodshed or a rope, but in a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a wooden chest at the foot of Martha's bed. The storm raged on through the night, a constant, shrieking presence outside the sturdy walls of the cabin. Inside, the three men slept on pallets near the hearth, the warmth of the fire a comforting blanket. Sterling found he could not sleep easily. He lay listening to the wind, his mind replaying the events of the day. He had come expecting to find tragedy, a grim but familiar frontier story. Instead, he had found a puzzle. Audrey Hale was not just surviving, she was presiding over a small, impregnable kingdom of her own. Her quiet competence was more formidable than any loud declaration of strength. In the morning, the wind had lessened, but the snow was still falling, thick and heavy. A pale, featureless light filtered through the single window. Escape was still impossible. The tension in the small room had settled into a quiet stalemate. Thorne had seemingly exhausted his overt challenges, retreating into a watchful, brooding silence. He sat hunched over a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the fire, but Sterling could feel the man's resentment radiating like a foul heat. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, Audrey approached Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low. "My mother's medicine is running low. It's a tincture for her heart. I have another bottle, but it's in the root cellar." She gestured toward a heavy trapdoor in the floor. "The entrance is outside, around the back. It will be completely buried. I would need to shovel it out. I was wondering if you and David might be willing to help. It's a two-man job to clear that much snow." "Of course, Mrs. Hale," Sterling said immediately, glad for a task, for a way to be useful. "David and I would be happy to." Thorne looked up. "A root cellar? I didn't know you had 1 inch. Robert dug it the first summer we were here," Audrey replied. "Before he even finished the cabin. He said a full larder was more important than a finished roof." Thorne's eye twitched. Another example of the dead man's maddening foresight. "I'll help," he said, his voice flat. It was not an offer of kindness, but a demand to be included. He would not be left out of uncovering any more of this homestead's secrets. Audrey gave a slight nod. "The three of you should be able to clear it in no time." The shovels are in the woodshed. The three men bundled themselves against the cold and stepped out into a world of white. The wind was still sharp, and it drove the snow into their faces. The area behind the cabin was a landscape of massive drifts. Audrey directed them from the doorway to a spot a few yards from the back wall. "It's there. The doors are slanted." For the next hour, they dug. The snow was heavy and deep, a mixture of old, packed layers and fresh powder. It was back-breaking work. Sterling and David fell into a steady rhythm, but Thorne attacked the snowbank with a frustrated violence, as if the snow itself were his enemy. Finally, Sterling's shovel hit wood. Working together, they cleared the heavy, slanted doors of the cellar. Sterling lifted one of the doors. A set of steep stone steps led down into the darkness. A wave of cold, earthy air washed over them. "We'll need a lantern," he called to Audrey. She was already there, a lit lantern in her hand. "I'll go. I know where everything is." She descended the steps, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. Sterling followed her, curious. The cellar was larger than he had imagined, a 10-by-10 room, cool and dry. And it was stocked like an army quartermaster's depot. Shelves lined 3 walls, groaning with jars of canned vegetables, fruits, and meats. There were sacks of potatoes, onions, and turnips in wooden bins. Barrels of salted pork and pickled eggs stood in one corner. It was a testament to a full season of hard work and careful preservation. Audrey moved to a small wooden crate on a high shelf. "Here it is," she said, retrieving a small, dark bottle. But as she turned back, her eyes met Sterling's. In the flickering lantern light, he saw the exhaustion she had been holding at bay. Her calm was a discipline, not an absence of fear. "He did all this for you," Sterling said, his voice quiet with awe. It wasn't a question. She nodded, a single, weary movement. He knew he was sick long before the doctor in Cheyenne gave it a name. He knew he wouldn't see another spring. So he spent his last summer building this. Her voice trembled slightly, the first crack in her composure. He called it his legacy. Not the land, not the cabin. This. The means for us to survive without him. "You honor him by being so strong," Sterling said gently. A sad smile touched her lips. "I'm not strong, Mr. Sterling. I'm just obedient. I'm following his instructions." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather book. "He left me a plan for everything. What to plant, when to harvest. How to prepare for winter. How to manage the fire. How to clear the roof." She held the book out to him. "He even left me letters. One to be opened each month of this first winter." Sterling took the book. The leather was soft with handling. He opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise hand. There were drawings of the roof-clearing mechanism, lists of supplies, and pages of prose. It wasn't just a journal, it was a manual for survival, written by a man for the woman he loved. It was the most profound expression of love Sterling had ever witnessed. It was practical, it was real, and it was working. He looked up from the book, his throat tight. He was a good man, Audrey. It was the first time he had used her given name. He was, she whispered. A shout from above interrupted the moment. It was Thorne. "What's taking so long down there? Find what you were looking for." Audrey tucked the journal back into her pocket, her composure restored. "We're coming," she called up. As they ascended the steps, Sterling felt a shift inside him. The mystery was solved, but the truth of it was more moving than he could have imagined. Audrey's survival wasn't a fluke or a secret fortune. It was a legacy of love, a partnership that had transcended even death. As they re-entered the cabin, a new crisis was unfolding. A strange, acrid smell was filling the room, and a thin haze of smoke hung in the air. Martha was coughing, her hand pressed to her chest. "The chimney," she wheezed. "The smoke's backing up." Sterling looked at the hearth. Puffs of smoke were billowing out into the room with every gust of wind. The flue must be blocked. The wind must have shifted and capped it with snow. This was a serious problem. A cabin filled with smoke was unlivable, and opening the door meant letting in the lethal cold. Thorne saw his chance to finally be the hero. "We have to get on the roof and clear it," he declared, grabbing his coat. "It's the only way." "No," Audrey said, her voice sharp. "The wind is too strong." And Robert had a plan for this, too. She hurried to the hearth, ignoring Thorne. She pointed to a small iron lever set into the stonework on the side of the fireplace, a detail so small they had all overlooked it. "He built a secondary flue," she explained, her voice quick and urgent. "It vents out the side wall, below the roofline. It's for emergencies, if the main chimney is blocked or damaged. This lever opens it." Thorne stared at the lever, his face a mask of fury. He had been thwarted again by the ghost of Robert Hale. In his frustration, he made a reckless move. "That's nonsense. A side flue won't draw properly. The only way is from the top." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "I'll clear it from here." He jammed the poker up into the chimney, ramming it upward with all his strength. There was a grinding sound of metal on stone, then a sickening crack. A shower of soot, snow, and broken bits of clay flue liner rained down into the fire, sending a massive plume of thick, choking smoke billowing into the room. The blockage was worse, and the chimney was now damaged. "You fool!" Sterling yelled, grabbing Thorne's arm and pulling him back. The room was filling rapidly with smoke. Kaiser was barking frantically. Martha was gasping for breath. The situation had turned from a challenge into a life-threatening emergency. Audrey didn't waste a second on anger. She acted. "David, help my mother to the door. Open it just enough for her to breathe fresh air. Mr. Sterling, the water buckets." She grabbed the lever for the secondary flue and pulled. It was stiff from disuse. She put all her weight on it, her knuckles white. With a groan of protesting metal, it moved. A moment later, they could hear a new draw of air, a faint but steady sucking sound. Some of the smoke began to pull sideways, into the new vent. It wasn't enough. Sterling and David were already dousing the main fire with water, which added clouds of steam to the smoky air. Thorne stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face pale with the shock of his disastrous mistake. He had finally created the crisis he seemed to crave, but it was one that threatened to kill them all. Audrey looked at the damaged hearth, then at the window where the wind still howled. Her husband had planned for almost everything. But he had not planned for the destructive pride of a man like Bartholomew Thorne. She had one last resource, one Robert had told her to save at all costs. It was a large, heavy roll of waxed canvas, stored in the rafters, intended for repairing the wagon cover or for use as an emergency shelter. It was valuable, almost irreplaceable out here. "Mr. Sterling," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Help me get that canvas down. We're going to have to board up the fireplace opening entirely and rely on the stove. It's our only chance to stay warm without suffocating." Sacrificing the open hearth felt like a defeat, a violation of the cozy sanctuary she had maintained. But it was the only choice left. The cost of their survival had just gone up, paid for not by money, but by a piece of her husband's carefully laid plans, a sacrifice forced upon her by the foolishness of another. The fortress had been breached, not by the storm, but from within. They worked with a desperate urgency. Sterling and David, guided by Audrey, wrestled the heavy canvas down from the rafters. Using hammers and nails from Robert's tool chest, they stretched the thick, waterproof fabric across the entire fireplace opening, sealing it tight against the stone. The work was clumsy in the smoky haze, but their movements were efficient. Thorne stood uselessly to the side, the poker hanging limp in his hand, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. Once the canvas was nailed in place, the effect was immediate. The smoke stopped pouring into the room. The secondary flue, now the only outlet for the smoldering embers, began to draw more effectively, slowly clearing the air. David and Audrey helped Martha, who was shaken but unharmed, back to her rocking chair. The cabin was transformed. The cheerful, dancing flames of the open hearth were gone, replaced by a dark, utilitarian patch. The room's heart had been cut out. The only source of heat now was the small cast-iron cookstove, which Audrey quickly loaded with wood. It would keep them from freezing, but the pervasive, radiant warmth was gone. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the undiminished howl of the wind. The three men stood in the center of the room, their faces smudged with soot. Sterling looked from the sealed fireplace to Thorne, his expression one of cold fury. "You could have killed us all," Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your pride almost suffocated two women in their own home." Thorne flinched as if struck. He had no defense. His arrogance had been laid bare for all to see. He opened his mouth to say something, an excuse or an apology, but no words came. He looked at Audrey, who was checking the seal on the canvas, her face grim and focused. She hadn't shouted at him, hadn't accused him. Her silent, competent repair of the damage he had caused was a more profound condemnation than any words could be. He had tried to expose her as weak and found himself to be the fool. The rest of that day passed in a heavy, oppressive quiet. They ate a cold supper of bread and preserved meat. No one had the heart for more. That night, as the men lay on their pallets, the cabin felt different. It was colder, darker. The loss of the hearth was a physical presence. It was a reminder of their vulnerability and of the fragility of the order Audrey had so carefully maintained. By the fourth morning, the world outside was silent. The wind had finally died. Sterling opened the door to a transformed landscape. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sun shone on a sea of pristine white snow, the drift sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The world was beautiful and deadly. "It's over," David said, his voice full of relief. "We can get back." They prepared to leave quickly. There was little to say. Audrey packed them some of the fresh bread and the last of the stew in a pail. As they stood on the porch, ready to begin the long trek home, Sterling turned to her. "Audrey," he said, his voice full of an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What you've done here, what you and your husband built, it's a remarkable thing. I'm sorry for what happened to your hearth." She looked at the vast, sunlit expanse of snow. "A fireplace can be rebuilt. Stone and mortar are just things. What matters is that we are safe." She met his eyes. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Sterling. It was a kindness for you to come." Her words pointedly excluded Thorne. Thorne shuffled his feet, unable to meet her gaze. He mumbled something that might have been an apology and turned to follow David, who was already starting down the trail. Sterling lingered for a moment. "If you need anything, for the repairs, or anything else, you send word to me. I'll see to it." "I know you will," she said. And in that moment, a new understanding passed between them, an alliance forged in the heart of the storm. The journey back was arduous, but the silence from Thorne was a relief. The story of what had happened in the widow's cabin would be told. Sterling would make sure of it. Not the whole story, not the private story of the journal, but the part that mattered for the community, the story of Thorne's arrogance and Audrey's quiet, unyielding strength. A man's reputation on the frontier was a fragile thing, built on competence and character. Thorne had shown himself to be lacking in both. 3 months later, the last of the great snows had melted, and the Wyoming prairie was bursting with the fierce, green life of spring. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new grass. On the Hale homestead, the signs of rebirth were everywhere. The patch of waxed canvas was gone from the fireplace. In its place was new stone and mortar, expertly laid. Sterling had come himself with 2 other men from town and, following the careful diagrams in Robert's journal, had rebuilt the chimney flue, better and stronger than before. Audrey's garden was already planted, long rows of mounded earth promising a summer harvest. The windows of the cabin were open to the warm breeze, and the sound of Martha humming a tune drifted out into the yard. Kaiser, the German shepherd, lay on the porch, his tail thumping a lazy rhythm against the wooden planks. A wagon crested the rise, pulled by a single sturdy horse. It was John Sterling. He no longer came as a rescuer or a concerned neighbor. He came as a friend. He had made the trip from his ranch at least once a week since the blizzard, sometimes bringing supplies, other times just to share a cup of coffee and talk. He brought news from town, and Audrey shared the progress on her homestead. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, carrying a small wooden crate. "Afternoon, Audrey, Martha," he called out. Audrey came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. A genuine smile lit up her face when she saw him. "John, you're just in time. The bread is coming out of the oven." The same scent that had met him as a shock in the heart of winter now met him as a warm welcome. It was the smell of home, of continuity, of life going on. "I brought you something," he said, setting the crate on the porch. "Some new rose cuttings for your mother. My wife was always so proud of her roses, I thought Martha might like to have a few." Martha appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright. "Oh, John, how thoughtful. Robert always meant to plant roses." As Audrey and her mother fussed over the cuttings, Sterling looked around the homestead. He saw the repaired chimney, the tidy garden, the healthy stock in the small corral. He saw a place not just surviving, but thriving. Bartholomew Thorne's power in Prairie Ridge had diminished. The story of his behavior during the blizzard, told quietly but persistently by Sterling and David, had done its work. Men who valued competence and humility looked at Thorne differently now. He had lost a measure of respect that money could not buy back. He had not made another offer for Audrey's land. He knew it would be useless. Audrey Hale was no longer seen as the poor widow on the edge of failure. She was a fixture of the community, a woman whose resilience had earned her a place of deep respect. Her claim was secure. Later, as they sat at the small table sharing slices of the warm bread with fresh butter, a comfortable quiet settled between them. The trauma of the winter had faded, leaving behind something solid and real. "You know," Sterling said, looking out the open door at the greening land, "I think Robert would be proud." Audrey followed his gaze. She thought of the worn journal, now kept safely in its chest. She thought of the final letter she had opened just last month, a letter full of his hopes for her first spring alone, for the life he had so desperately wanted her to have. "I think so too," she said softly. Love, she had learned, was not just a memory or a feeling in the heart. It was a foundation, sturdy and deep. It was the foresight to cut wood for a winter you would never see, the care to build a cellar to feed a family you would leave behind, the wisdom to draw a map for a path you could not walk with them. Robert was gone, but his love remained, a fortress of preparation and care that had weathered the fiercest storm. And now, in the warmth of the spring sun, new things were beginning to grow. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.